The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's an increasingly significant contrast or disparity between state laws and federal marijuana laws. Some states have started to have, for years now, medical marijuana, decriminalized or even legalized recreational marijuana, even though this is still illegal at the federal level. And then we have all these questions that come up. For example, will feds proactively enforce federal marijuana laws in states where it is legal? Or what about medical marijuana? What about decriminalized recreational marijuana? And it creates what's this really inefficient, aside from silly patchwork of conflicting laws. There's another issue that's been going on because of the federal illegality of marijuana, and that's this banking issue. I've told you about how increasingly marijuana businesses in states where it is legal or decriminalized, medical, etc., have a really hard time getting a bank to work with them. And as a result, they end up having tons of cash on hand. So one of the problems that's obvious when you have so much cash on hand, and it's known that you have cash on hand, is that you become a target for those who would want to steal that cash. There's a new bill at the national level that would legalize medical marijuana. So this is not recreational, but it is, at least for the time being, a bill to recognize federally the legality of medical marijuana. It would end the federal prohibition on medical marijuana, and it would also remove some of this ambiguity regarding the state laws that conflict. And this was introduced by Senators Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, Cory Booker, Democrat from New Jersey, and Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat from New York. Kind of an interesting coalition of elected officials there. It would first and foremost untie the hands of doctors when it comes to recommending medical marijuana, particularly when we look at veterans doctors who are bound by the VA and federal laws. They would be allowed to recommend medical marijuana. It would also untie the hands of bankers who say, listen, we operate across multiple states, and nationally, this is still against the law, even if in your state it's legal. And that would solve this issue of the cash and the lack of access to banking. In addition, the end of a federal prohibition on medical pot would recognize marijuana's medical benefits by switching the classification of the drug from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. And this is a really, really big deal. The federal government has a 5-category drug classification system, and the removal from Schedule 1 alone doesn't necessarily change the legality of it, aside from the fact that this particular bill does go further and do that. Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act is the most tightly controlled substances, and they are under the umbrella of drugs which have no currently accepted medical use. So moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 would also officially say, at the federal level, we recognize that there is medical usage, there is medical value here to marijuana. So this has been a really big crutch for the anti-legalization movement, which is, hey, you can say whatever you want about maybe it's good for this condition, or maybe it's good for that one, or we shouldn't criminalize a plant, but it is a Schedule 1 substance, and changing that would be a huge, huge thing. Lastly, the bill would also expand access to medical marijuana to patients in states that have approved limited medical marijuana laws. So there are some states where there are broad medical marijuana laws, but in some states there's only been approval of cannabidiol, which is a substance from marijuana that doesn't produce the high associated with the drug, and it's used for treating epileptic seizures. That's great, but that's a narrow application. So this would also expand access in some of these states. This is a very good thing. We will see what ultimately happens. We need time to let this sort of foster in the system, and we're going to continue covering it. I'm starting to get the feeling, as we see, similar to what's happening with gay marriage, where you just start getting the feeling that there's a certain type of momentum. I'm not saying we're exactly at the same point with marijuana, but we're starting to see some of that momentum, and it would not be surprising at all to me if within 10 years we have full legalization, medical, recreational, etc. I don't know if you've been covering the story of this racist incident, this insane, heinous racist video involving the University of Oklahoma's chapter of the SAE fraternity. And the latest is that the University of Oklahoma yesterday expelled 2 students that were accused of playing a leadership role in this racist video. One of the students issued an apology. The family of the second student also did. The song that they were caught singing on video goes, "There will never be a nigger in SAE. There will never be a nigger in SAE. You can hang him from a tree, but he can never sign with me. There will never be a nigger in SAE." The video was posted online just a couple of days ago by Unheard, which is a black student group at Oklahoma University. And it shows the students on a rented bus singing the song. The song also makes references to lynching. It says, we're never going to accept blacks into our fraternity's chapter here in Norman, Oklahoma, even though the chapter has actually had black members in the past. There's another layer to this, which is that the school's Delta 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 sorority chapter also was feeling some of the heat because they had some members who were seen in the video, but this has mostly been focused around SAE. And there's another piece to this now, which has come out, which is that the house mother for the chapter of SAE initially expressed being appalled by these horrible videos, and this is going to be taken very seriously, and so on and so forth. Except now there's a video of her repeatedly using the N-word and just laughing it up. Take a look at this video. This is not the issue of foremost importance when it comes to what's going on college campuses, but this is absolutely insane. That particular chapter of the frat has been dismantled and kicked off campus. This house mother started fundraising for herself because she said, oh, because the frat chapter was dismantled, I lost my job, started fundraising and actually raised some of the money. And then this video leaked of her saying nigger, nigger, nigger. And now that fundraiser has been taken down as well. And it amazes me with the recent fallout that around race and around these types of incidents, wouldn't you think that anyone who is smart enough to get into college would be smart enough not to go around singing songs like this? And I know that University of Oklahoma is only 5% black, and maybe there's a feeling of comfort around this or safety that you're not really going to get in trouble. But broadly, with regard to college students being racist, kids are not born racist. They are taught racism from somewhere, and who knows where they're from. It's the first place I would look, obviously, would be the parents. But you could say, well, maybe it's the local media environment where they grew up or something. You could make some other case, but typically it does start with the parents of creating a framework of either racial understanding or racism. And the link here in racism seems to follow SAE, because 4 years ago at Cornell University, the SAE chapter was also closed down, and many members left the school altogether because they hazed a black student to death. George Dadune, who was an aspiring doctor, was 19 years old, sophomore from Brooklyn, New York, son of Haitian immigrants. His hands and feet were tied with duct tape and zip ties. He was blindfolded, and he was given so much alcohol that he died within a few hours of the hazing, all alone, unconscious. He was found dead by a college cleaning crew the next morning. His mother filed a $25 million wrongful death suit in the case. Just think about what's going on, right? I mean, this is tragic at its face, but when viewed in light of the recent controversy at SAE, we obviously have to wonder what the racial implications are broadly for SAE. I saw on CNN that the SAE spokesperson or some PR guy for SAE saying there's just nothing at all that is connected specifically to SAE and racism here. But we've seen numerous SAE chapters cited for egregious racism at Clemson, Washington University, Oglethorpe, Baylor, Valdosta State, as I mentioned, Cornell. and now University of Oklahoma. We'll continue following the story. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we get some emails from the racism apologists saying that there's some kind of double standard here and white people are oppressed and nobody takes racism against white people seriously. I anticipate that. I don't really care. This is a story of racism, and this is a very egregious story, and the number of factors at play here are just absolutely sickening. We have a new article from Forbes with data from our great sponsor, Polaris Financial Partners, and Bob Detrick, who we interviewed recently. And it's about the kind of summing up the state of the economy under President Obama. We continue to get new numbers, and we continue to kind of analyze these numbers in the context of past presidents. And I know that the right is not going to like this. I know I'm going to get emails saying I'm the one who doesn't understand economics, in spite of the fact that I have undergraduate and graduate degrees in economics. I'm going to be accused of merely carrying water for President Obama, in spite of the fact that we've been hugely critical of so many aspects of President Obama's presidency. Let me give you the data. This week marks the 6th anniversary of the stock market's upward run, with the S&P up 206%. Only 3 times dating back to World War II have stocks had such a prolonged, sustained series of growth. At the same time, we talked to you recently about the jobs numbers. Last week saw yet another month with over 200,000 new non-farm jobs created, which makes the current rate of job growth, listen to this, the best in 15 years. At the same time, the US dollar is hitting new highs against foreign currencies that have not been seen in 12 years or more. The euro, for example, $1.06 to 1 euro. Remember that in 2011, it was almost $1.50 for 1 euro. And Bob Detrick wrote that this hasn't surprised him, that he has run the numbers, and this is far more common under Democratic presidential administrations than under Republican ones. I know, you're going to come at me and say, David, you're cherry picking the data. You are conveniently excluding data that would show how great Republicans are. This is not the case. And as Bob Detrick has told us, he's a financial advisor. He's in the business of making money for his clients. So there is no particular reason why he would prefer Democrats in office if indeed they were not more beneficial to the economy and to his clients. And he has told us time and again that the numbers are just the numbers. And if you look at the S&P, Bill Clinton and President Obama have performed similarly, with about a 17% annual rate of return through their first 62 months in office. This is 70% better than the approximate 10% return of the best Republican presidencies economically. I don't know how else I can tell you this. The numbers are the numbers, and this is a very real situation. Now let's talk about caveats. Let's talk about what is not going quite so well. Wages. Wages are an issue that needs to be worked on. Wages have been increasing over the recent years, but certainly not as fast as many of us would like. Poverty remains an issue. Access to health care and quality education remains an issue. These are all social issues, but also economic issues, and we need to address all of them. But we have to accept the data in terms of the economy. And we just have to admit that historically Democrats are better stewards of the economy. And we're going to have Bob Detrick back on either at the end of this month or early in April to talk about this in more detail. If you have specific questions, if you're one of the right-wingers who says, I'm distorting data, that Bob Detrick and Polaris Financial Partners are distorting the data, send me specific questions and we'll get them to Bob during the interview. You can call 219-2-DAVID-P. Leave us a voicemail with the questions for Bob.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Remember that you can support our program if you ever shop at Amazon.com. You can first go to our website, davidpakman.com, and just click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page. Do your Amazon shopping, and then you will be sending us a kickback with no forms to fill out. You won't see anything different, but you will be supporting our show. You can also become a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership. And today's new member of the day is Gene Stanley. Gene, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member and for going above and beyond and having a level 4 David Pakman Show membership. You were joined today with 2 new Membership Hall of Fame members, Nicholas Guarnieri and Perry Huntoon, have been with us for 4 years now, the duration of one presidential term. You are part of the Membership Hall of Fame, and that qualifies you for a free David Pakman Show apparel item of your choice. Go to davidpakman.com/gear to figure out what you would like. Email us and we'll ship it out to you right away at no cost. Great day for Gene Stanley to be David Pakman Show member of the day. It is a very special day today because it is time for Hatriot Mail.
The right of the people to keep and bear hate shall not be infringed. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
I don't really know what to call this week's Hatriot Mail. It is related to Pat Robertson. We don't often get people who write in and staunchly defend people like Pat Robertson. There's a movement on the right, which while they believe a lot of the same things as Pat Robertson, maybe for optics, they always say, you know, people like Pat Robertson are not really good representations of what it is to be godly. This particular Hatriot disagrees. They're angry about some of the things we said about old Pat Robertson. Take a listen.
Pac-Man bullcrap. I just listened, and Pat Robertson did not tell any mother to beat any child. What he said was to spank the child. Spanking is not beating, and this Pac-Man show is distorting the facts, which is deception. This is called bearing false witness. No one can trust anyone or any show that distorts the facts. The Pac-Man show sucks and is not godly or Christian.
Well, certainly this is not a Christian show. I think if there's anything that's precise and accurate in that Hatriot Mail, it is that no, this is not a Christian program. As far as whether spanking is beating or not, you can go back and check out that clip. It was very clear that Pat Robertson was advocating physical violence against children as a means of imposing discipline, something which we know does tend to lead at a higher proportion to conservatism. So certainly one way may be to raise more conservative kids instead of sending them to college, which seems to open up their minds and make them realize that progressive ideals are logical and make more sense than the right-wing ideas. Instead of sending them to college, beat them as they grow up. That is more likely to get you a conservative child once they get older. So I guess they have that going for them. But no, if the standard is that this program should be Christian, it certainly does not meet that expectation or that desire. If you haven't heard by now, we've been following this story of Arkansas legislator Justin Harris, of course a Republican, and his wife Marcia. They are in an increasingly crazy scandal. Let me back it up for you. Justin Harris is a guy who owns a Christian preschool. He is a man of God, pro-family, all that stuff. A couple of years ago, he adopted 2 girls. And after adopting those girls, we found out that he gave the girls away. Now, when I say gave the girls away, he did not actually give them up for adoption and they were subsequently readopted by someone else. They didn't go into a foster home. He merely gave the girls away to some guy who had been teaching for a little while at his Christian preschool. Turns out that guy raped the 6-year-old, just gave the girls away to a child rapist. The latest up until yesterday was that Justin Harris was saying he and his wife are actually the victims here, not the 6-year-old girl who was raped by some dude they gave her to, because the Department of Human Services, Child Services type of department, was ignoring their calls, and it was just all going really, really bad. The DHS didn't report to them that these girls had some emotional trauma, which the DHS refutes, of course. And the latest is by far the craziest detail. There's a report from a college student who was a babysitter for the Harrises, okay, and explained that the girls had been exorcised, that there was an exorcism that took place. The first night I was over there, I just broke down and cried with this little girl because I felt so bad for her. According to the babysitter, the two girls were kept in separate rooms that were outfitted with locks, alarms, and video cameras. They were not allowed to be around each other because of the Harris's belief in demonic possession and telepathy. So Justin Harris, legislator, adopter of girls, owner of a Christian preschool, believed if the two girls were too close to each other, because they were demonically possessed and telepathic, they would be able to communicate in a way that was bad. Ultimately, there was an exorcism done. They actually brought in specialists from Alabama who came to the house to orchestrate an exorcism. Other sources confirmed that Marcia Harris told them at least one exorcism was performed on the girls. This guy owns a Christian preschool. He's doing exorcisms on adopted girls and then giving them away to child rapists. He considers himself a man of God, a man of love, a pro-family man. They really should be prosecuted for child abuse. They likely won't be, but they should be. These are the lives of innocent children that had no control over their care, no control over the environment that we're talking about, isolation, deprivation, exorcism, and then just giving them away like a commodity, like an iPad that you don't want anymore, to someone who they might not take care of the iPad, happened to rape one of the girls. Sickening, sickening story. And every day it seems to get crazier and crazier. Mike Huckabee said something really weird on hate radio. He went on the American Family Association, a registered hate group from the Southern Poverty Law Center list, went on there and said that it is secularists who want to impose their values on conservative Christians. Here's what Huckabee had to say.
The point is that for many of us, we are accused of wanting to impose our religious values on someone else. The fact is, we just don't want someone's secular values imposed upon us.
This is so ignorant because we hear this quite a bit, actually. Secular values, secularist values, are not values in the same way that Christian values are values. Secularism is not a system of values. It's the idea that there is total separation of church and state. State religious institutions are not connected to state and federal and governmental institutions, and that everybody is 100% equal before the law, regardless of religion or belief. Individuals are not treated differently based on their religion or lack thereof, and religions are not prioritized in any way, one religion over others. Christian values are actually values. We could have a discussion over whether they're good values or not. They could be good, like unconditional love, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, something like that. They could be harmful values, anti-gay, anti-science, whatever. But secularists don't want to impose values in the way that Christians want to impose values. Secularists and secularism has the desire of the law being followed. Separation of church and state. We don't give preference to one religion over another. Christian prayer in school, for example, organized by the school, as opposed to, hey, we don't know if kids are praying in their heads, right? That's one thing. Nobody can control that. But establishing Christian prayer in school violates secularism, at least if these are public schools. A federal holiday for one religion, but not for any others, like Christmas, a federal holiday, actually is not secularism. And these allegations from Huckabee are similar to those who say atheism is a religion. Atheism is a religion in the same sense that not playing golf is a hobby. If I say, oh, I don't play golf and that's my hobby, that's like saying atheism is a religion. It does not make any sense. And secularism being values like Christian values are values is equally ridiculous. I have a sense Mike Huckabee probably knows this, but he's on hate radio, right? He's, of course, throwing red meat out there for people to eat up like it's being spoon-fed to them, and it works. The hate radio viewers absolutely love it, and maybe we would see this type of garbage from Huckabee if he decides to run for president again. I don't think that he will, but I've been wrong in the past, and I may well be wrong again, and I would actually welcome him running because this type of comedy would be a really great thing, I think, in the Republican primary, which is shaping up to be Just hilarious, no question about it. Next, is the United States an empire? And if so, will it fall like so many empires have?
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by David Coates, who holds the Worrell Chair in Anglo-American Studies in the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. His latest book is America in the Shadow of Empires. And empire is a very interesting and far-reaching issue. When we talk about empires, how do we define an empire?
Well, normally we understand that empire is having a territorial expansion, so that actually you end up governing places far away from the core. And that's why people turn around and say, well, no, America doesn't have an empire because it doesn't have colonies in that sense. I mean, we did try that, of course, in the Philippines, and there are many, many American bases now scattered across the world. But empires slide towards hegemonic powers, and I think somewhere in that slide we can locate the United States. And what it means is that there are some parts of the imperial experience of other countries that don't apply to the United States, but there are many insights that still come from looking at them when we think about our own situation now.
So in other words, there's a slightly different paradigm under which we're to evaluate whether a country is an empire today than maybe several hundred years ago.
Yes, I mean, the critical shift, of course, which is why the British Empire becomes such a reference point for us, is the development of global capitalism. Now, the United States is inserted into that global capitalist system. It plays a very dominant role in it right now. In the process of doing that, we've kind of picked up some pretty major commitments, including major military ones, that increasingly take us back to that earlier form of imperialism when the way you control the world was through your troops.
And we're going to tie this concept of empire into what's going on with ISIS today. But before we get to that, in your book, you talk about the eventual failure of 4 of history's greatest empires. So for context, tell us what those 4 empires are.
Well, we look at the 4 empires that, in fact, have touched the United States in the most direct fashion, really. The Roman Empire, which is really the model to which everybody else responds and around which the architecture of Washington is clearly built. The Spanish Empire, without which the United States in its present form would not exist. The British Empire, that in some sense we stepped into the role of, that is, as the British Empire went down. And finally, the Russian and Soviet one. I mean, clearly Alaska comes from the Russian Empire of the Tsars. The Soviet Empire was the evil empire with which we battled for 30 or 40 years. So those 4 together seem to me to be the right reference points for reflecting on our present condition.
Of course, all 4 of those empires had many distinguishing factors, but is there something in your study of this that you've identified as a common theme that united all 4 of these ultimately failed empires?
Well, there are 2, I think, aren't there? One is they all fail. Empires rise and empires fall. So periods of dominance which look as though they will last forever, slip away, and that's one of the issues we've got to think about in relation to ourselves, I think. And also what they do, and why they slip away in part, is that the price that's paid internally for the external role and the external dominance comes over time to be too high. And in that sense, empires that come into existence because they are internally stronger than the countries that they come to dominate, but they then go down as the price of that dominance erodes that economic and cultural strength. And that's the argument in the book. We are at a tipping point in a way. We're paying so high a price internally that we're losing the economic and cultural dominance which inspired our global role in the first place.
That's a pretty common trait of humanity in a sense, isn't it? And by that I mean many people, regardless of whether we're talking about empires or not, are often not as in tune with the impermanence of whatever the status quo is. And it seems like a common thing that people fall into, believing that the status quo is going to be such indefinitely. And history often tells us that that's not the case.
That's right. I laughed only because it's true of people too. You're in your prime, and how do you know you're in your prime? Because you're just poised to lose it. There's a sense in which there's a natural trajectory here of rising and falling. It can be managed in different ways. I think the other thing that we're wanting to say in the book is right now our capacity to shape the pattern of our own future is largely in our own hands. We can go on chasing every imperial dream of sections of the political class, or we can pull back systematically and carefully and do more nation building at home again rather than nation building abroad. So in that sense, the awareness that decay awaits all empires doesn't mean to say that we've got to volunteer for it.
And make the case that, or let me frame it this a different way. Just because great empires have failed, as you outline in your book, America in the Shadow of Empires, that's not necessarily proof that all empires must fail. Could it not be possible to learn from the mistakes? Or do you believe that there is something inherent to empires that will ultimately bring them down?
Well, timing is everything. In the long term, we're all dead. So it may well be that partly what we're talking about here is how we manage this process to make America's important role in the world last as long as we can. But it's quite clear that in all the empires we've seen in the past, as they have spread their tentacles out, they've altered the world that they govern, of course, in ways which make it less and less like the one with which they began. And we're seeing that ourselves now, I think. So that, to give you just two examples, clearly the reconstruction of West Germany after the Second World War is one of those magic moments in the American imperial story that people always go back to and say, we've done it once, we can do it again. We've ended up, of course, facing an economy that's so much stronger in trade terms than we are. And by the same token, we, quote, beat the Soviet Union, we beat communism. But in the process of doing that, we created the conditions in which China is released into the global capitalist system on new terms, and we find ourselves with huge trade deficits with them as well, and therefore unable in some crucial sense to control their foreign activities. So I think what we're seeing in the American story is pretty much the usual classic pattern of success eroding the conditions of its own success and heading people towards some process of unexpected decline.
So let's connect the dots now to what you see happening in terms of ISIS. How does that figure into the discussion of empire?
Well, I think in relation to ISIS is clearly horrendous. And so there's a very powerful impulse, particularly after the terrible things that were done to the American journalists, to chase them to the gates of hell, as Joe Biden said. But in the process of doing that, rather than taking a limited but real military action simply to demonstrate that this was unacceptable to us and must not be repeated, we've got ourselves sucked back into a third Middle Eastern war. We look like we're moving back into a condition of almost permanent militarism. And that has a couple of consequences. I think one is it doesn't work. I don't even think it leaves us more secure in the short term, and it certainly doesn't in the long term. But also it compounds this problem we've got, that we are at home are running down our economy. We have massive poverty, a squeezed middle class, a whole range of things we need to address at home. And yet our resources are being poured into a kind of Middle Eastern quagmire from which we feel some responsibility, because after all, we went in 2003 and created much of the dysfunction that's now operating there.
Well, let's pause there, because I think that's an interesting point. I share your basic framework for what you're laying out here in terms of the permanence of war, how that fuels the military-industrial complex, dating all the way back to Eisenhower, essentially. But it does also feel, like you alluded to, that the particular ISIS engagement, if it does grow and continue to grow, which it may well it may happen that way, is connected to some responsibility we bear for having destabilized the region in the first place in 2003. So does that not change the character of this engagement?
Well, it certainly factors in. You and I are entirely at one on that, I think. And you even saw that in the president's explanation of why we're going in, that, he doesn't want to put troops on the ground, but we need to be there helping. Because in some sense, this is our mess. Pottery barn rules apply. We broke it. We own it. But we can't solve it. This is a fight within the Muslim world between various kinds of Islamic coalitions. And we can be a part of that exercise on the edge, as it were. But this notion that we're the country that continually calls together coalitions of the willing, that doesn't operate through international agencies even when we can, and that we put ourselves at the forefront of this fight, seems to me to do several things. It actually makes sure that the ISIS will gain more credibility amongst its potentially radical audience, precisely because it's fighting the big devil. And it actually takes the burden off the very forces that need to be engaged directly to stop ISIS, which are other Islamic forces. Those are there on the ground. We don't need to be leading this one. And we've got ourselves sucked back into a war almost as a kind of product of two videos. Two terrible events, but we're getting bounced and goaded back into a war when we should actually be systematically, incrementally pulling ourselves back, as I thought we were doing under this president until that point.
Last thing I want to get your thoughts on in the limited time we have left. Given your expertise in the history of failed empires and your current analysis of the U.S., is the single best move, in your opinion, that the U.S. could make to preserve its status around the world? Would it be to pull back from being a sort of international policeman with the military? Or is there some other, if you were to say, here's the one best move the U.S. could make now, something else?
No, I think that's right. I think actually we've got to start pulling our people, our men and women in uniform, back and stop operating on the double standard where it's okay for us to invade other people's spaces, but of course we get absolutely outraged if anybody comes near ours. And I think we've got to begin to reposition ourselves as a global power that uses its soft capacities, not its hard ones, as its major way of interacting with the rest of the world. It can't be done overnight. We've got to pull back in a moderate, responsible way, but pulling back is definitely vital, I think.
We've been speaking with Professor David Coates. The book is America in the Shadow of Empires. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Ron sent me this story. It relates to Saudi Arabia. I've talked so many times about this insane double standard about the American alliance with Saudi Arabia, and it's getting really bad there. Amnesty International has now warned that the rate of executions in Saudi Arabia has reached unprecedented levels. Saudi Arabia killed 4 criminals in 2 days last week, and the local media there have said that the Saudi authorities are trying to hail the killings as an example of the government's commitment to, quote, maintaining security and realizing justice. However, what we actually are seeing is that these are absurd killings for many non-crimes. Amnesty's Saudi Arabia researcher, who is Savag Kachichian, said that the growing number of executions was all the more worrying because of the lack of rhyme or reason behind it. Quote, despite claims sometimes made by the authorities about carrying out executions to deter terrorism and other violence in the Kingdom of Saud, almost half of this year's executions have been for non-violent drug-related offenses. Often the trials are unfair, defendants are coerced or misled into making false confessions, and Saudi Arabia already has one of the highest rates of execution in the world. And this is where it really gets insane. Remember, this is one of the greater allies of the United States. They have executed people for such so-called crimes as apostasy, leaving your religion, and sorcery. One of our closest allies, Bush, shows up and kisses the hands of the royal family. One of our closest allies kills people for sorcery. At the same time, if any developed country is going to be allied with Saudi Arabia, it actually would be the U.S. because most of our developed colleagues have already figured out that the death penalty should be eliminated, and they don't really have a place for even politicians that want religious-type Christian versions of Sharia law to be presented. So there is probably an element of U.S. culture that would like to see people punished harshly for nonviolent drug offenses and things like apostasy, particularly if you're leaving the Christian religion. it's time to end the friendship. I don't know how else to say it. You know, I sit around and just try to figure out the logic behind this thing. We claim to be against this type of Muslim extremism. And aside from the obvious double standard that we have many Christian extremists legislating in this country, we're also really friendly with Saudi Arabia as they are executing people for things like sorcery. And it's all about money, it's all about oil, and it's all about shared interest and stability in that region to maintain the flow of oil, et cetera, end the friendship. I can't say it any other way. I've spoken before about how I really don't like tipping. Not that I don't like tipping personally. I do tip, and I tip generously, but I don't like the concept of the expectation of a tip. Here in New York City, everybody needs a tip. You tip the guy who gets your car if you park at the valet parking. You tip the maintenance guy and the porter, and if you have a doorman or other people that work in the building you live in, you tip them. You're expected to tip your dry cleaner if you go regularly. You tip around the holidays, and I could go on and on, but you tip everybody in New York City. And I'm increasingly annoyed with the entire tipping culture, particularly around restaurants, because it creates this situation where if people aren't familiar with the expectation, if you travel to the U.S. from another country, you're either going to be put into a situation where you are criticized because you're not tipping enough, or you are going to have a different expectation from people depending on what country they're coming from as far as what the right tip is. And I believe that restaurants should just pay employees a living wage, and that will be that. No tipping. And that is exactly what a new restaurant in Philadelphia has done. This is the William Street Common. It's been open less than 2 weeks, but the owner, Avram Hornick, says they are already on budget, hitting their numbers with a very different business model. It's an indoor beer garden. He pays everybody, the servers, dishwashers, the hostesses and hosts, everybody, $15 an hour plus paid sick leave and health insurance benefits. And the experience for the customers is pretty interesting. All of the drinks cost $6, and it's very clear. It's a $5 drink with a $1 service charge, which is used to subsidize this salary that the individuals get. Quote, "We want people comparing apples to apples," said the owner. "Instead of charging $6 and no tip, we want the customers to understand that the staff is being taken care of." The service charges don't go straight to the individual servers. They go into this pot, which is then used to make sure everybody hits that $15 an hour wage. Management will make up the difference if the revenue from the service charges falls short. And if there's extra money, they divide it up. So you could actually end up making a couple of dollars more per hour than that $15. I completely agree with this. The practice of tipping is one that adds nothing to society. We should establish a system where the prices are the prices. You eliminate all of these cross-cultural and cross-country issues. You eliminate if you're one of the individuals that is worried about certain groups that tip less or more based on what country they're from, or you have racist or xenophobic stereotypes around tipping. We can eliminate this entire thing by saying the prices include reasonable salaries for everybody who is working here, period. And this is when rarely I'll use the shared vehicle services like Uber or Lyft. I will use Uber because the service is already priced in, as opposed to Lyft, which allows you to tip. Uber says this is the price, that's the total, no tipping involved. Although the pricing is about the same, I will choose Uber every time because I don't want to encourage what I consider to be really a problematic element of society, tipping. Let's just eliminate it, completely support what this Philadelphia restaurant is doing. If you have any questions, comments, complaints, or criticisms about anything I've talked about today, call us, 219-2-DAVID-P. That's our voicemail number. We got a voicemail from Troy York responding to the story yesterday about Planet Fitness kicking out a woman who complained about a transgender woman in the women's locker room. Troy wasn't too happy about my commentary. Of course, that is not actually the right clip. We will play the correct one for you.
David Packman and Louis Randall. This is Troy York calling about I'm incensed by your program. Today, talking about defending the transvestites. that pervert who wanted to use the locker room.
So transvestite pervert, already an ad hominem. We have no evidence at all that this transgender individual has done anything that would qualify them as a pervert. Continue.
At Planet Fitness.
Yeah.
Your defense of this pervert is appalling. You talked about how he should have the right to be comfortable. What about the women that they had to have this freak with a cock in women's clothing walking around the locker room?
This freak with a cock in the women's locker room.
What about their rights and feeling comfortable?
Yeah.
I think the reason you guys are defending this guy's rights and Planet Fitness's proposal to allow him in the locker room is because you two are transvestites yourself.
Yeah. By the way, what's with the choice of terms saying transvestite? That's not a term that we used once in that story. I can't really give any kind of reasonable response to Troy York because he just so eloquently pointed out what was wrong with our point of view. We've got a great bonus show today. We will talk about other planets that may be better for humans than Earth in terms of habitability. And we will also talk about the potential of borrowing antifreeze proteins from other organisms to make humans more resistant to the cold. Very interesting research being done. DavidPakman.com/membership is how you sign up.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.